The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning or good afternoon to everyone, no matter where you are in the country or even around the world. It's been amazing to see the engagement that we have had through the Vanderbloemen Network live webinars. We've had folks join us from all over the world, and it's just been amazing to build community and remind us that we are in this together in this strange, strange time of COVID-19. So I'm Holly Tate. I'm the Vice President of Business Development here at Vanderbloemen, and we are so grateful that you have chosen to spend this time with us on your Tuesday to learn from Tim Stevens, my colleague and our VP of Consulting at Vanderbloemen, and Steve Gillen, who's the former Interim Senior Pastor at Willow Creek. And we're going to be talking all about specifically how to lead through crisis. We kind of dug in last week to real practical topics of online church and stewardship and giving in crisis. But today we're going to talk about leadership in crisis. I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. This is a series of webinars that are on more broad topics that are specific to the COVID-19 crisis and helping you lead through that. We've also been doing Facebook Lives specifically about the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, under the CARES Act on Facebook Live. We've been doing those every few days. And so there's been a little bit of confusion, which I totally understand. I'm leading them and I'm confused. So I can only imagine how some of you are confused. But I'm going to drop some links in the chat box, which actually leads me to introducing you to your chat box and your questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So I'm already seeing so many of you share with us where you're joining us from. It's so cool to see from Wyoming and California and Maryland. But I'm going to drop a couple links in the chat box, so make sure you navigate over that way. The first link that I just shared is a blog where our Vanderbloemen team is keeping this blog updated literally up to the minute with what we know about the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a part of the CARES Act. This is what our COO, Sutton Turner, is encouraging every 501c3 to apply for, specifically churches. We want as many Christian organizations as possible to get access to this funding. To the best of our knowledge, it sounds like banks are supposed to get initiation instruction tomorrow. So we have been doing our hard work to try to get you updated with your spreadsheets and get all the numbers crunched so that you can get access to that funding as soon as it's available. The second link that I am about to put in to the chat box is our churchcovid19.com. It directs you to this vanderbloemen.com/COVID-19 page on our website. And this is our COVID-19 hub specifically for churches. We have another one for schools, schoolscovid19.com, but this one is for churches. This is a hub where we have gathered resources from our partners, from our own team. We are creating new resources every single day about the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as interviews with thought leaders and the replays of this webinar. So I get a lot of emails about, hey, I missed the replay, or I loved that webinar. How can I share it with our team? Please go to that link right there, vanderbloemen.com/COVID-19, or www.churchcovid19.com, where we will be posting these replays and you'll have access to all of our many COVID-19 resources. So thank you so much for bearing with me, guys. I just wanted to make sure that you all knew where you could get access to that information. And yes, I'm already getting comments. Some folks have already called their banks, and their bank doesn't yet have the information for churches. So hang in there. To the best of our knowledge, based on two things. One, our own reading of the bill, Sutton Turner, our COO, and then also a webinar he was on specifically for churches with Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina last week, who said that churches are included, and he worked specifically on the Paycheck Protection Program. So those are the two data points that we are operating off of. There's a lot of banks and CPAs that are still skeptical of that out there, but we are just encouraging churches to go forth in your number crunching, have your spreadsheets ready. It would be better for you to apply to this and be told no than go off of something that you heard that maybe you weren't eligible. So it's better to just go ahead and try to apply and get that funding than not try at all. All right. So without further ado, you've heard me talk enough, but again, I'm Holly Tate. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Vanderbloemen. So I spend my days lately with you guys on these live events, and it has just been so energizing for me to hear your story and pray for you and connect with you every single day as a part of the Vanderbloemen Network Live. I am also joined by Tim Stevens. Tim, if you want to give a little wave. Tim is our Vice President of Consulting. He and I have gotten to work together for almost 6 years, which has just been incredible. I learned so much from Tim working alongside him every day and watching him lead. He himself has led through crisis. So Tim, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Some people, they've heard your story before. They've been on all of our webinars, but some people, they have never heard of you. And I would love for them to hear your story. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Thanks for letting me join you today once again. This is kind of fun. So kind of 3 parts to my life. I started in a nonprofit ministry, spent 9 years there, working in churches around the country. This was a renewal/revival ministry. So in my 20s, I got to really get to know the broad church, the breadth of the church pretty quickly. We traveled around the country as in over 800 different churches during that 9-year period. Met my wife there, which was the best part of that experience. And we settled down in a church plant that had just popped up near our house. A church called Granger Community Church was meeting in a movie theater about 20 minutes from where we lived, and just got captured by the vision and the mission of that church. And they asked me to come on staff after we were attending there a couple of years. That was back in 1994. We had about 250 people and 2 different theater screens that we were using. This was, back in the day. And stayed there for 20 years. Church grew to about 6,000 in size. Lots of fantastic ministry and impact in our area there. We were really kind of located in cornfield, basically there in northern Indiana. But it was cool to see how God worked over the years. And then, as you mentioned, Holly, 6 years ago, got to join the team at Vanderbloemen, and now get to help churches all over the country with all kinds of things, including staffing and succession and leading through crisis, like we're talking about today.
That's awesome, Tim. And you've actually written a couple books that have advice of a little bit of your own story and then also advice. Can you share? I'd love to type in the chat box those books that you'd encourage people to check out that are specifically about leading through crisis in different ways.
Yeah, probably the most relevant one is a book called Fairness is Overrated that I wrote about 5 years ago. It's a book with just leadership principles, and it's divided into 4 sections. The first one's about leading yourself. The second one is about building a great team. The third one is about building a great culture. And then the fourth one, which is applicable today, is about leading through crisis and tough times. So that'd probably be the one that's most relevant and helpful to folks.
And I love that one because I am more of a skimmer. And Fairness is Overrated is, it's 51 other principles, right? Or 49?
51, you're very, very right.
So then there's a total of 52.
Mm-hmm.
See, I can do math sometimes. 52 principles, and it's 52 chapters. So it's broken up into very short, bite-sized chapters. And so I love Fairness is Overrated. It's an awesome resource. I just put that link to Amazon in the chat box for anybody who wants to check that out. All right, Tim. Well, thank you so much for being here. I know that you were on conference calls until about 9 p.m. our time last night serving churches. And so we're so grateful for your leadership and glad that you get to be here. And we also have Steve Gillen. Steve, we are so grateful that you've taken time to help share your story. You have incredible experience of leading through really difficult times. And most recently, you are the former Interim Senior Pastor at Willow Creek Community Church in Chicagoland. And so would love to hand it over to you to share your story. and then we'll dive into more of specifically your experience in leading through crisis. But how did God lead you to where you are today?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks so much for the invitation, Holly. It's always a joy to join you and as well all those who are with us. Thanks so much for being with us. And part of my story, I joined the Willow Creek staff right out of college, actually, to help start a ministry called Access that was reaching 20-somethings. Basically, that ministry and others started to have crises, and I found myself with the chance to lead in it, and actually had a chance to lead multiple ministries at our South Barrington campus. Then had the chance to lead 2 regionals that were in crisis at different times. And then most recently, 2 years ago, stepped in to lead interim here at Willow overall. And one of my mantras is never waste a crisis. And the idea on that is for your own learning and for your growth. The truth is we all face crises. There's health crises, financial crises, all sorts of crises you're going to face. And so don't waste them. Don't try to just get through them. Learn from them, grow from it. Just develop skills. And what I found as I look at my life is little crises that seemed huge 10, 15, 20 years ago helped shape me for the ones who we're facing today. And so that's part of my story. And but I will tell you, when you're trying to lead through a crisis, I actually find leading in a crisis one of the most, as sick as it sounds, enjoyable times, because in these moments, leadership really matters. And every day counts, every decision counts. And so the crisis we are all in right now, I'd tell you, as hard as it is, these are really important times to lead well and lead with all diligence.
Absolutely. And it's really an amazing time to, personally, I mean, these are difficult times, for all of us, even us at Vanderbloemen. I'm getting emails every day from church leaders, nonprofit leaders, small business owners, where we're all just really forced to put it at the feet of the Lord. And so for me personally, it's been a time of reflecting and realizing we are not in control. I think for a lot of leaders on this call, we don't like not being in control. I can speak for myself. I like to be able to control things as much as I can. And this is a time where no matter how hard you work, no matter how smart you are, you cannot control the outcome of this. And so I love your perspective, Steve, on that let's not waste this opportunity to A, draw closer to the Lord, and B, sharpen our leadership skills as we seek Him and seek each other and help from those that have gone before us, leading through crisis. So let's dive in a little bit more specifically about your experience serving churches and ministries through crisis. I would love for you to be able to dive in a little bit about what has that looked like. We don't need to get into nitty-gritty details, but just crisis can look like a lot of different things. For some churches and nonprofits and schools that are listening today, maybe there's been a moral failure in their organization. Maybe there's been financial fraud. Maybe there's been just, distrust in leadership or miscommunication or varying differences between the board and senior leaderships. All of those things I just listed, I email with folks about all day, every day who are facing those crises. So can you kind of walk through kind of those broad topics that you've had experience dealing with that maybe we can dive in a little bit today to help people who are also facing that in their own organization today?
Yep. Yeah. So, when I think about it, I really think about it more as a timeline. And there's an initial stage of crisis, and usually you find yourself in a crisis. You rarely create it. And all of a sudden you just wake up and you go, oh, it's now crisis time. And at this point, this is the classic fight or flight moment where a lot of emotions come up. And so I always say to leaders, first thing you have to do, the first person you have to lead in the crisis is yourself. And you will actually be probably the hardest person to lead in the crisis. And so your own emotions, everything you're going through, everything you're feeling, disappointments, most leaders already have a vision of where they want to go, and the crisis interrupts that. And then the speed with which you can calm yourself, think clearly, get clarity on what you have to do. I think that's really probably the most crucial thing. The thing I always tell leaders, in the moment that you realize it's a crisis, you have to slow down. Everything in a crisis is pushing you to speed up, speed up, speed up. And actually, as the leader, you've got to slow down so you can make wise decisions. And so I would tell you first, what's your pace? What are you revving at? And how do you get a little more control of yourself to slow down, be thoughtful, whether that's journaling, taking time, but find meditation practices that will slow you down. And once you've got that, you've got a clear plan on how you're going to lead yourself. And again, on this, I'd just say too, it involves sleep, exercise, healthy eating, relational connections. There's all these different sides to leading yourself through the crisis. The second thing I'd tell you is you have to build your team. And you've got to get a team that you trust and respect, and you have to get a team that's committed to action. What you don't want in a crisis is people who like to philosophize and think, but don't like to get things done. In a crisis, things done and do them quickly and do them wise. And so building your team's key. Don't try to lead alone. And even if you're a pastor of a small church or leading a small organization, invite volunteers in, invite in a team, invite others who have expertise that can help you is crucially important. The other thing I tell you is part of leading yourself in a crisis, that team is going to lift you. The crisis we've been going through at Willow, we're almost at year 2 now. And there's really a core group of people who are my team. And the funny thing, in any given day, if you talk to them, one of us will be down, a couple of us will be just okay, and then a few people are doing really well, and the people doing well lift the rest of us. The next day, it all flips for absolutely no reason. And that's part of the crisis, is there's an emotional toll to this that it's hard to quantify, but that's why you want your team to just lift you and kind of balance you out and keep you motivated to go all the way through to the finish line in the crisis. The other thing I tell you is in this, the problem you'll find it changes. And what I would challenge everyone, and I don't know your situation, each of you individually, or where you're at. We're in Chicago, which is becoming one of the epicenters of this crisis right now.
Yeah.
Initially, this hit a few weeks ago with the pastors I would talk to, their crisis was how to keep the doors open at the church. Or then it became a financial crisis and staffing crisis. Rapidly here, at least, it's becoming, how do we take care of the sick? How do we feed the hungry? How do we care for the mental health crisis that I think is another part of this? And so what you're going to find is, in a real complex crisis, the problem changes many times daily. And so you have to be able to work the problem to pivot to what's most important and dramatically push off what's not needed. What can be left for tomorrow, you leave it for tomorrow. What is not yours to control, which, by the way, many of us don't control much in this, don't waste a minute on it. So push all those things out of the way and go, what's mine? What can I control and what can I influence? What has to get done today? And prioritization really becomes the key. And your team is there to help you prioritize and focus so that you do the right things at the right time and in the right order. And you won't get it all right. Crises are not about perfection. It's about getting to the finish line. And it's not about doing everything right. You're gonna make lots of mistakes.
That's so, oh, so
Go
sorry.
ahead,
I was so excited about your response. It was so good. I interrupted you. Steve, that's so good what you said about anything that's not urgent, that doesn't need to be dealt with today, push to the side. Because I think it's easy for those of us, again, to go back to what you just said about wanting to be in control. I think sometimes it's natural for us to respond impulsively because we can control this thing that might not be urgent. But we force everybody to kind of respond in that moment. It's an easy thing that I think those of us in crisis want to do because it makes us feel like we have more control. But really, it's to take a deep breath, realize what needs to be dealt with now, and push everything else to the side. Tim, what would you add to that in your experience? You've led through several crises on your own when you were an executive pastor. What would you add to any of what Steve just said?
Yeah, first, let me just kind of reflect on something Steve said. I've had the chance to get to know Steve here in the last years. We've been working on the Willow Senior Pastor search, and have loved watching Steve, your ability, your shepherding heart. I love the balance that I've seen with you and the team there between bias for action and kind of shepherding people's hearts and their souls. And that's a balance sometimes you can get one way or the other on. So I've loved that. Loved your first point about just taking care of yourself. And I'm thinking, like, so many church leaders right now are like I am, sitting in an office in front of a computer at their house. They can't leave, they can't get out. You're going stir crazy. Your kids are all over the house doing online school and college and whatever. And it can be easy just to work from the time you get up till the time you go to bed because you got stuff to do and you're caring for people's hearts and their lives and trying to make decisions for the church. And I think that's every now and then, man, just get up, walk away, go for a walk, get outside if it's not snowing or raining, and spend time kind of focusing on your soul. One comment I would say, just from my experiences leading through some of these things is sometimes the leaders, many times, this is not true in today's crisis, but many times in a crisis, the leaders know about the crisis before the congregation of the church or the people find out about it. Moral failure, embezzlement, whatever. A lot of times you're carrying this information, you're working through it, you're figuring out a communication plan. I've been in times when, you got 6 people on your team and 1 gets taken out or 2 get taken out because of poor choices. And suddenly the rest of you are carrying everything. You're carrying the weight of the relational loss and emotional loss, but you're also carrying their work. And sometimes as leaders, we can get ahead, and we are ahead. We should be ahead, but we don't give our people a chance to kind of emotionally catch up with us. So sometimes I've been in situations, I've made this mistake where you come in and you kind of figure out a plan in 2 or 3 or 4 days. Then you start kind of unrolling it. Church finds out, the staff finds out, the elders find out, and you're kind of in action mode because you've been living with this for 3 or 4 days, and it can be easy not to let people also catch up and grieve a little bit and emotionally adjust before they're ready to say like, okay, I get it. Let's get to solutions now.
That's so great. And Tim, that's actually a fantastic segue into my next question for you guys, which is, what are the mistakes that many organizations make when leading in crisis? And you just alluded to that, Tim, that a lot of times it's, we forget as leaders that we're often, by the time that we're delivering the bad news, what you just said, we've had sometimes only a few hours, but sometimes many days to process it before we're bringing it to the team. And so we make the announcement and spring into action, and our team is still spiraling or maybe needs some time to digest what we've said. So that's a fantastic word of advice to a mistake that we see a lot of organizations make. Steve, what would you add to that? What are some of the mistakes that you've seen organizations make when it comes to a time of crisis?
Well, again, walking through a crisis, you're going to make lots of mistakes. Again, that's why you want to learn from them. The ones we made, I'd be honest about, we didn't communicate enough. The more significant the crisis and the emotional toll, the more frequent your communication needs to be. I would tell most churches and organizations, now's the time. You're probably going to double or triple the amount of communication you normally do. If you did a weekly email to the congregation before, it's 3 or 4 a week at least, if not daily. Over communicate, even if you go, there's nothing new to say. It's okay just to say, this is what we decided, this is what we're working on, here's what's next. Just those check-ins, and then some emotional aspect to care for people. That'd be number one. And I would say that was one of the mistakes we made, was we just didn't communicate enough. And in this, the other side was many times you go, I don't have all the answers. And so that can be the reason you don't communicate. And I just tell you, you don't have to have all the answers. It's okay. Other issues we had, other mistakes we made. Tim brought up the best point, caring for yourself. When you don't care for yourself, it has a huge toll on everyone. But one of the ways I see leaders making a mistake is they misassess the timeline of how long this crisis will take. For our crisis at Willow, the most recent one, it all hit in the spring of 2018. And as we got to the end of 2018, everyone in the organization was excited to flip the calendar. We couldn't wait for 2019 to begin. And there was this huge hope that it'll all get better. And we turned the calendar with these hopes. And then 2019 was hard again. And it kind of crushed morale. And the truth was, there's nothing magic about a calendar flip. But in this crisis, I am seeing leaders who are underestimating how long this is going to take. And I talked to a pastor right when this was starting, and I said, how long are you going to close the doors to the church? He said, just 1 week, and we'll evaluate next week. And I said, you're going to be exhausted if you do this every week. This is going to be a while. And so I would overestimate the time this will take. If it takes less than that, great, celebrate. But if you say, we're going to open, like some pastor I talked to said, we're going to be open at Easter. And I thought, right now, he is grieving the fact that's not going to take place. So make sure you overestimate the time. What you want to do as a leader in this is you want to under-promise and over-deliver. Don't promise anything that you can't control, that you can't make sure to deliver, because that impacts your trust. But the other side is just for yourself. If you underestimate the time, there is an emotional toll that happens to you when you miss a deadline or when you realize this is going to take longer. So set it as a long-term goal, and then establish the patterns personally and for your organization that are going to keep you healthy if this takes quite a while.
Yeah, and I would add another thought, Steve and Holly, is a lot of the pastors I'm talking to right now, the crisis under the umbrella of a pandemic, the specific crisis is having to let people go because finances are not where they have been. Some of them are, I think, operating out of fear that they won't be. Some of them are operating out of reality that it's just true. I heard of a church recently that had to lay off 80 people just last week. So one thing I would just say, if you're in that position where you have to lay folks off, these are people you love, people you are in a small group with, people you've raised your kids with. I mean, those are not easy decisions. And just remember in that conversation that because it's a church, you're wearing two hats. You've got this employer hat that someone has to wear, and you've got this pastor hat that someone has to wear. And often I've learned that the same person can't wear both hats. When you're telling someone that you can no longer employ them, sometimes it's just too hard for that person to also accept you as their pastor. So as you walk into those conversations, with graciousness and delicateness, and hopefully with some way to help them post their last day, just kind of think through with your team, who's going to deliver the news that's going to be awful, and who's going to pastor their soul if they'll let us, who's going to pastor their family and care for them in that season.
That's great.
Yep. On that, Tim, in the fall of 2018, I was just talking about this, we realized pretty quickly we were going to have to do a round of layoffs. And once you realize you have to do these, again, that's a decision you've got to make. The only thing you can control from there on is how you do them. That you do them is necessity for the organization. How you do them, you can control. And so, again, we communicated pretty early on. We weren't, we told everyone it's going to take time to process this, but we want to let you know. So we want to build trust, and we want to be transparent. And then we just said, we want every one of these people, it's not their fault. And if you've got to do this in your organization, no one in your organization caused this. These are all good people. So how do you let them have dignity and respect? How do you honor them? How do you take care of them financially? But really how you do it then will become as important as the decision itself.
That's great. And I've got 3 fantastic questions from David, Shannon, and Steve that we're going to get to. So guys, hold on, bear with me. We're going to open it up to Q&A in just a minute. For the rest of you who have questions but haven't asked them yet, please do put them there in the questions box. We'd love to answer all of the questions that we can today. So Steve, on that point that you just said about you can control how you deliver news or care for folks through a crisis. So I think communication is a vital part of leading through crisis. Can you speak to what you've learned in your own experience of what an organization should have their communication look like, specifically during a crisis?
Yeah, those of you who are senior leaders, what I would tell you is part of the communication for you personally, this is tricky. You've got to de-escalate for some people. And people who need to make decisions, you've got to de-escalate this so they can make wise decisions. For those in your organization who really can't do anything, you want to de-escalate as best you can through your presence and your tone and your words, just to help give them calm. It seems like the whole world right now just feels like it is filled with fear. And so if you can pastor your people just with a tone that says, we're going to be okay, we're going to get through this together. Now, there's a second group that you actually have to motivate and escalate for them. And that's the people who have to get to work and do something. And different crises are different. And this one, there's a lot of us who kind of can't do anything. But there are healthcare workers and others that your words can help keep them motivated. And so the communication is this real difficult balance of who do you de-escalate, who do you escalate. The communication in this one, for us at least, again, this is different than others. You didn't create the crisis. So the conversation really is about how do you keep people informed? How do you keep people really cared for and encouraged? How do you give them really good advice as well? As pastors, again, and leaders, we need to take this seriously, and we need to tell our people to really be careful about how we congregate, how we meet with people. Really, our words really matter in this time. And so you choose your words carefully, communicate frequently. and do your best to really help people focus on their health and the health of those they love.
Yeah, I think in anything, in any kind of communication, without information, people make up their own truth. And then the longer that they don't have the correct information, the more that sets into concrete. And then it becomes reality. It becomes the new narrative. And so, you know, as church leaders, as organization leaders, we need to set the narrative with openness. You can't, in some crisis, you can't say everything that you know. Information that isn't inappropriate, unlawful. There's reasons you can't say it, but I found that, especially in the church world, people aren't surprised that churches have problems. They just don't want them to be shoved under the rug or to be surprised by them or shocked by them. I remember times when we just had to stand up and communicate just, horrific financial news. And we would always kind of be bracing for a backlash, and, folks in the congregation would be like, we get it. Our company goes through this too. We get it. Thanks for telling us. Appreciate it. We needed this information. So something I learned from John Maxwell like 35 years ago is don't forget the meeting before the meeting. So anytime you have bad news to share, just think about sequencing that information. So, you probably don't want to share it to the congregation for the first time on a Sunday if you haven't talked to your board members yet, if you haven't talked to your staff yet. So sequencing, like, okay, the end result is the whole church needs to know whatever this bad news is. Who do we not want to hear it for the first time when the whole church hears it? Well, we don't want the board to hear it then. We don't want the staff to hear it then. We've got these certain key stakeholders, influencers, people that are in various volunteer roles. We don't want them to hear it first either there. So sequencing that communication, because then you get people, when you have to deliver it to the whole congregation, you have 20, 30, 50% of your people sitting there kind of shaking their head because they know and they understand, and you've walked them through it and you've kind of shepherded them through it. And then they can be advocates with you in delivering that information.
Yeah, for us on this, a couple of lessons we learned was we were overly defensive. And actually, we found even a year later after the crisis started, our communication, we found at times we would be defensive. And we had to really have that team in place to go help us be wise so we're not defensive anymore. You want to be in front of the narrative if you can. And to Tim's point, what we found was in the absence of information, the congregation created stories that were almost pathological. They were so much worse than reality. And so be factual, tell it like it is, be upfront, own what's yours to own. Leaders, one of the best things you can do in a crisis is admit mistakes. That actually will build trust if you just own it. If you don't, it actually breaks trust immensely. And as Tim said, especially in a crisis, people know mistakes have been made. How you communicate, that you do it in a timely fashion, that you're upfront, that you're not defensive, that you own what's yours to own. It'll actually build trust, we found.
So wise. Thank you both so much. Communication is such a big topic, and it looks different for every single organization. But those critical key components that you just described of sequencing, Tim, to your point, figure out who needs to know what, when, and make sure that the leadership team is aligned on that. And then Steve, I love what you said about your own realization of the defensiveness, because that's everyone's reaction initially. But to be able to have that team around you that specifically is aligned on, what do we need to share, and when do we need to share that, so that we're not leaving the congregation or staff up to creating their own stories. We've got lots of questions coming in. They're fantastic. So I want to make sure that we go ahead and dive into that. But before we do, we're getting a lot of questions about reorganization and layoff. First of all, I just want everybody on this call to know that you are not alone. This is a topic that almost every single organization that we're working with is dealing with this right now. It's a reality that we're having to face of who do we furlough and how do we do it, and who do we lay off, and how do we reorganize our staff in this time where we're financially hurting? Because the reality is, for most of us on this call, giving is down. And we're offering a free 30-minute call with our consultants, which is Tim Stevens' team, specifically about this topic. So we're talking about reorganization or layoffs or furloughing. There's no strings attached. Promise, this is not a sales pitch. This is literally our team just trying to provide their wisdom and advice because they consult with this. I mean, Tim has consulted with Steve on this topic at Willow Creek as we've helped them with their lead pastor search and just figuring out how do we help our team and our staff during this time. So you can email me and I'll be happy to set that up with our team. But let's dive into some Q&A. So David, this question is dear to my heart since Nashville is my hometown. I've actually emailed with David already this week, and David, I've been praying for you. I can't imagine what you guys are facing. So David is in Mount Juliet, and they were in the direct path of the tornado in early March. And then obviously, they've been quarantined. They were quarantined exactly a week later. So Steve, what advice would you give? I mean, he's just asking for just broad advice for their church. They've got 2,000 members. David, we're praying for you. But Steve, what advice would you give to help David lead through this time?
Well, again, David, I'd tell you, if you can prioritize, like, what's the crisis of today and what can you control today? I don't know everything in your situation, but you've had what many times happens, which is one crisis leads to the next one and they just compound on each other. And so, the best thing I could tell you is be very close to your congregation through whatever means you can. Communicate with them, stay close to them. Be that kind of steady hand at the wheel, is what we always talk about when you're in a difficult spot. And that doesn't mean you have to be steady all the time. You got to admit, there's going to be moments you have difficult days as well. But I would tell you too, I don't know the size of your staff, but as best you can, if you can give your staff, every one of them, a job to doing this, whether it's checking in on people or trying to help out those. What I'm finding from a lot of people, especially if they're in good health, is they all want to know, give me something to do. Everyone wants something. And so if you can think of tangible ways for people to help out, we found that really makes a world of difference. Yeah.
That's great. Shannon is asking, so Steve, earlier on in our first question, you mentioned the initial stage of crisis. Are there subsequent stages?
There are absolutely different stages of the crisis. And the difficulty for me, at least, is most of them have been different. In a turnaround, whenever I have a turnaround campus that's in struggling, the first stage is really assessment, where you go, like when I step in a turnaround, I ask, are the stories of the past greater than the hopes for the future? If all they want to talk about is the good old days, I go, it's probably a good idea to shut it down. It's not going to get going. But if they dream of the future, then you can move to stage 2, which is about assessment and rebuilding. So each one has different stages. The key is for you to understand what stage are you in. The interesting thing with the coronavirus crisis now is actually we can see future stages from areas that are further along. And so our country can learn from countries that have already experienced this. The cities, like in Chicago, I'm looking at New York City to go, what are they experiencing? What can we forecast? Probably our reality as well. So you can begin to see the stages there. But part of leading in a crisis is adaptability. Every crisis has little nuances and differences. And so for you to just be on your toes and assess what has to happen today is the critical thing.
That's great. Tim, this is a great question from you from another Steve. Steve is the name of the day. So Tim, beyond the initial shifts and adjustments, especially related to providing care, one big challenge of this particular crisis is the duration and the way it's reshaping how we do ministry in general. A lot of the usual ways of measuring our ministry effectiveness has changed, but I'm not sure I know what the new measures look like. Any recommendations for how to measure ministry effectiveness in this ongoing crisis? What measurements should specific areas of ministry use? For example, outreach, discipleship, family life, etc. Any advice there, Tim?
I don't know about advice. I have some thoughts. A friend, Ray Johnston, said, I heard him say the other day, this is the season we're going high. You have to go high tech. Every church, whether they had technology built to communicate to their people, have had to figure that out in the last 3 or 4 weeks. But as you go high tech, you also need to go high touch. And I think, we have different ways of measuring, right? We used to measure up until 3 weeks ago how many people came in the box. Whatever the size and shape of your box is, how many people came in the box, and everyone sat in straight rows and listened to the person up front and worshiped together and then left. And then, we engaged in other ways as well. But a lot of those things that we used to measure are shut down. So I think figuring out how to measure engagement How are we touching? How are we engaging? How are we reaching out? How are we helping each other and others? I talked to a pastor a couple days ago, and he has a staff of about 40, and he said he got them together that morning, and he said, "Hey guys, like we are a digital church. We no longer have any property or campuses. So we may be paying you to be a custodian. We may be paying you to set up and tear down and produce. And how long does it take you to get 2 worship songs ready for the video? You got extra time in your week, right?" So, and they just started moving people around departments, because some departments were overloaded, especially like in their community outreach and care. And other departments were like, till we're meeting again, we don't really have a whole lot to do. So kind of just readjusting, like if we had no building, no property, no gatherings, and we had these 40 people, what would we do? Let's just rethink this whole thing.
No, that's great. Yeah, Steve, what would you add to that?
Yeah, some measurements that we have as leaders are aspirational. Here's who we want to become. And it's, attendance is aspirational. I want to add more people. Giving can be aspirational. Others are more about assessment. Like you think about it in your health, a thermometer is an assessment. Are you healthy or not? In my opinion, in a crisis, the assessment measurements are really important. How are you doing? But I would also tell you the aspirational ones, many times, these are the wrong goals during a crisis. And so we found our attendance numbers in the crisis last 2 years actually demotivated us. And so we said, let's put it aside. We're going to use that as an assessment tool, but not aspirational, just to give ourselves grace. And so Tim's correct. The world just changed, and it may have changed for a few months, or it might be longer than that. But who do you need to become, and how do you innovate? I would tell you, if you can measure things like that, that'd be a really intriguing way to motivate yourself to the right things.
That's really good. And I think what you said earlier, Steve, is agility and flexibility is the key. So, Tim, to your point, this week measurements might look one way, and then next week you go, wait, you know what? We measured the wrong things last week. Next week, let's measure this things. Just give yourself grace as you figure it out together. You mentioned, Steve, well, both of you actually, in your answers, talked about caring for your own soul as a leader while leading through a crisis, and talked about how important that is. But let's get a little bit practical. Cole is looking for how do you actually care for your own soul as a leader while leading through crisis?
So here are my practices that I did. When this all hit, I knew the temptation would be to work all the time. The temptation would be to stop exercising, to eat poorly. There'd be all sorts. And in a crisis, this is a terrible time, but this is one of those moments you pick up addictions and other things. And so I prioritized, there was one night a week. And again, this is the last 2 years, one night a week that is for friends. And it's on my calendar. And I asked those friends, I said, I need you. And so that night was with friends. I got up and exercised every day. And basically what I found was, if I said I was going to exercise 3 days a week, I missed 2, and then I only exercised 1 day a week. So I say every day, I'll probably miss 2 or 3, but at least then you're getting 4 or 5 in. So physical exercise, time with friends, and time with friends in the season's different. So, it could be you need actually solitude more than time, because if you're like me, I got kids with me all the time. When my wife comes home, she needs time. And so solitude's important, whether it's a walk or just journaling. But really, you got to think through your physical health as you exercise, as you eat, your relational health, and then your spiritual health. It's really easy in a crisis to get so focused on serving others, you're not actually growing yourself. You're not reading the Bible for how it feeds you and not feeding somebody else. And so I find, actually, especially now that we're homebound, getting a schedule and a routine is critically important and incredibly difficult. And so I would tell you, don't just sit and binge on Netflix. Don't just sit on a couch. Move and plan and stick to a calendar schedule.
That's great.
That's good. Yeah, I would add, you referenced it with solitude, but whatever it is that feeds your soul, so for some people that's, walking through a park, which I think we can still do in a lot of areas anyway. For some people, it might be reading a book. For some people, it may just be refreshing, sitting on your front porch or your back patio and just refreshing. And we all have different ways. For my wife, it's being around her with people, which she's doing a lot via Zoom these days. For me, it's being away from people, which is hard these days, especially when all the kids are in the house and everything. So you just have to kind of figure that out. But pay attention to kind of those markers in your soul. I had a friend, my pastor for 20 years, Mark Beeson, he talked about as kind of these markers. He talked about them as rumble strips. You know, he would say if you're in the lane you should be, that's great. And then there's a solid line, and if you go over that, you're kind of getting off the road. And if you hit the rumble strips, that's kind of to wake you up and to say get back in the lane. If you go past the rumble strips, you're going to go off a cliff. You're going to hit a guardrail. So whatever those rumble strips are for us individually, and that can be people, that can be your spouse, that can be just knowing what triggers you and what takes you to addictions or to places, darkness in your soul. It takes you kind of off the path that you want to be on. And so pay attention to those rumble strips.
That's good. And I think what you both mentioned your spouse, which I think is a key thing for us to remember. We often marry our opposite. I know I did. Tim, your story just reminded me, I love being outside and my husband does not love being outside. So this was Sunday. He was like, I'm going to go lay in the hammock for a few minutes. I was like, oh, great. I'll come with you. He goes, I just need some alone time, and that's just such a great example. I think it's also really important that we're, thinking about what rejuvenates our spouse, so I let him lay in the hammock and I just read a book, about 20 feet away from him. And that was good because I was getting my extrovert time and he was getting his introvert time. So just some funny stories that come out of this, but what fills your soul? And then also if you have a spouse, to keep that in mind as well. Tim and Steve, Joseph wants to let you know that he's praying for you, for strength and wisdom, since you're at the center of advising so many through this season. So thank you, Joseph, for that. Kelsey has a couple of great questions. Kelsey is asking specifically about how do you deliver the news to someone that you need to lay off? And Kelsey and everybody who's on this call, we're going to be specifically talking about reorganization on Thursday. Tim and I will be talking about that. And so we'll be able to dive deep into this topic because I know it's something that a lot of folks are thinking about and praying through right now. But what advice, Tim, would you give to Kelsey, who is asking about how to deliver the news to someone when it comes to a layoff?
Yeah, I think clear communication. It's a horrible thing to have to tell someone. So I think you want to be clear. If it's, I'm going to assume the crisis is related to the pandemic, not related to something else, but basically, clear about where we're at as an organization, why we have to make this decision. The first question people will wonder is, why me? Did I do something wrong? Was my performance not up? And you have to be able to talk through that and truthfully and authentically. I think from the organization side, make the decision soon enough that you're able to provide some help for that person. Sometimes I see leaders kind of make the mistake where they just get all the way up to the edge and they have no cash in the bank, no whatever to be able to help that person survive on the other side of that. Fortunately, right now, there's some government programs that make that a little more viable than is typical. But I would say, I mentioned earlier in this program, the two hats that you wear, and be aware of those. I think it's helpful maybe to have two people in the conversation, someone maybe that provides more of the HR function that's delivering kind of the news and the facts, and someone else that's there to pastor or help pastor or try to pastor them. I would say put it in writing too. When you're sitting down with someone and they're losing their job, especially a layoff, where it's not for cause, they didn't walk in the room or wake up that day thinking they were getting laid off. So their mind is immediately going to be cloudy, and the only thing they're going to be thinking is, how do I feed my kids, keep my kids in college, whatever. So put it in writing too. Don't expect them to remember everything that you're communicating them verbally. So give them something that they can walk away with. It's more specific.
That's great. Steve, this is to build on that in a time where you as a leadership team are having to do reorganization and layoffs. How do you keep the rest of the team that's remaining at ease and try to keep morale up during that time? What advice would you share on that topic?
Yeah, so especially if you're thinking about either a reorg or time of layoffs, the first thing I would tell you is you want your layoffs to all happen on one day. You don't want to extend it out, and you want to do enough you don't want to end up having to do a second round of layoffs within a few months. You want to be able to say to them, this is the day, by the end of the day, everyone will know. And the next day, we'll know who's left, and we're going to work together on this. Part of keeping them motivated is how you care for their coworkers and their friends who just lost their job. Yeah. And so that you show them dignity and respect, that you honor them, that you don't blame them, that you thank them for their service, that you really, you need to be sincere about this. This isn't their fault. These are good workers. They did a great job. And this is totally outside the circumstances. And so the better you honor them, the better I think their coworkers will be motivated to stay. And I think once you get on the other side, then you make it clear we all have a lot more work to do, and we got to keep moving ahead. And we found actually the day after our round of layoffs, it was really interesting. There's a lot of anxiety leading up to it. The day after, it was like this release, practical jokes started happening around the office, just because, yeah, the fear that led up to that day was so heavy on people. And yeah. If I was thinking about corporately, hopefully they know first, no surprises. So you want to let them know we've got a financial issue. That's first, we're assessing. Second one is we're making cuts in our budget. Hopefully you've already done this. We said at our organization, any spending above $500 in the season goes all the way to the senior pastor office. So they get, this is not the time to spend money. Then third, we've done everything we can, but we think it needs to be these cuts, and it's staffing. And then fourth, here's the day and the time. I'd have it all in writing. I'd have it memorized. I like Tim's thoughts. I agree with it. You've got a pastoral person and the factual person. And the minute they hear their job's done, the question is all going to go to, how are you going to care for me? And so it's actually that the individual meeting is not long. It's only a few minutes. But you need to be on your game. You be thoughtful, and you need to know it's going to be exhausting emotionally. It will take a toll as you have anxiety leading up to it. Again, caring for your soul, the end of that day, however you can care for yourself, whether again it's walks, reading, you really need to take that seriously, because it takes a toll.
That's fantastic advice. Steve, this is a question for you, and then Tim would love to hear anything you have to add. For crisis organization and communication, do you create a team to lead? Is there a leader of the leaders, or do you act as co-leads? What if there is jockeying for that leadership? How do you set the tone for structure?
Yeah, so my perspective, how I lead is there is a leader, and then there's a team that works with that leader. Candidly, the minute you know it's a crisis and you call in your team, you set the tone day one. And you know, mine is leave your job description at the door and your ego. We have a bigger problem to fix. If your ego's getting in the way, you probably aren't. You should not be on this team if your ego's going to get in the way. We have got to serve our organization, and if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be on the team. So I like a leader. I like a team that's devoted to work with that leader, and then from there on, it's really about servant leadership. And if they can't do that, they're not on the team.
It's great. Tim, anything to add to that?
100% agree. I think having that, you know, it's almost like what do they call it in the White House? A situation room. You know, you're kind of in wartime when you're working through crisis, and you have a situation room, and you have a group of leaders around the table that led well and done well. You get to the end of that situation, and you're closer, and you're tighter, and you're more unified, and more productive than you've ever been, because you have to be. You've been forced to go there.
Absolutely. Steve, could you talk more about over communicating with your congregation and staff? Any practical tips of what that looks like, how often, when, etc.?
Yeah, so just be vulnerable with you. I got to a spot where I was so exhausted, I didn't feel like I could communicate more. So we formed a communication team, and that team helped do all the communication. So I would kind of talk through, here's what I'd like it to say, and then they would craft a lot of the language, a lot of what's written. So for me personally, where I'm good is interpersonally, where I'm good is, honestly, I don't want to read a script, I just want to talk to you, whether it's in a sermon or something else. So I knew where my time was going to be devoted was face-to-face or public gatherings. The written communication taxed me. I sat and would stare at it for hours. And so that's where I had a team who would take my ideas and write it and craft it, make it sound way better than I could. So again, I would tell you that's one of the teams we had. I would encourage you to do that. And then that team was the one when I was down or frustrated or tired, they would say, it's time to send another one, let's go. And they would even bring ideas to me. Here's the topics we're hearing. Here's the questions we're hearing. And so I would think through, who do you have, either volunteers or staff who are good at communication, who are good at either writing or speaking, and delegate to them the ownership of it. Now, again, you as the leader may still need to be the voice of it. But I found as many of those things I could delegate that I wasn't good at, the better we were.
Absolutely. Well, Steve, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to add the targeting of your communication. I think sometimes when the staff is determining what gets communicated, they're filtering that through what they want to hear and their staff members around them want to hear. When the congregation is just like, let's get on with it. Like, why are we still talking about this? Didn't that happen like 6 months ago? Where the staff's still feeling it because they're in it every day. So just targeting, you have to really use some discernment to figure out what group needs to hear what, so you don't wear them out.
Absolutely, for sure. Well, I'm going to, one more time, I am putting the churchcovid19.com website in the announcement or chat feature. I think it's called different things on different people's panel, but that is where you can get the replay link of this. It'll probably be up in the next 24 hours or so, as well as stay updated on all of our COVID-19 resources, including information on the Paycheck Protection Program. We also want to let you guys know, again, that we are here to support you in any way we can. Our team is happy to hop on the phone with you and talk through anything that we can do to help you related to staffing, succession planning, anything to do with your team during this time. That is what God has called us to as a company. And so we are here to serve you. And it's been so great. I'm seeing so many comments come in, Steve and Tim, of thanking us for doing this, that this has been so helpful. So I'd love to pray for you, Steve, before we let you go today. And feel free to email me, guys, with any additional questions. I'll do my best to respond, but let's pray for Steve. Father, we come before you, and Lord, we just pray for Steve as he has led through crisis for the last several years. And Lord, we just pray blessings upon him. We pray for rest and peace and rejuvenation, Lord, even in the midst of this current coronavirus, Lord, that you would just help rejuvenate his soul, that he would be brought closer and closer to you during this time. Lord, we thank you for the wisdom that he shared today and how it's helped literally hundreds of people who are on this webinar. So, Lord, we pray that you would guide and direct his steps. Lord, give him wisdom and discernment. You've given him such immense influence, and we pray that he would continue to steward that well, Lord, as he helps draw more leaders and people closer to you, as he is such a great leader of his church and his sphere of influence. And so, Lord, we pray for every leader on this call who is doing their best to lead and care for their congregation and staff through this crisis. God, we pray that you would give us all wisdom and discernment through this time. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, thank you, everyone. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Join us back here on Thursday. It'll be Tim Stevens and I chatting about reorganization. This is a topic I know that is near and dear to many of you as you try to do what's best for your organization. So we will be here to guide you through that. Thanks again, Steve, and we hope everybody has a great rest of their day.